I swapped my cheating husband's lube for glue, and the firefighter had to pull them apart. What I witnessed at 3 a.m. will haunt cheating husbands everywhere. I'm about to tell you the most insane story you've ever heard. I'm Grace Richard, and when I discovered my husband's secret affair after 15 years of marriage, I didn't just get mad, I got creative. What I did to my cheating husband with a simple tube of superglue turned his betrayal into the most embarrassing night of his life. This isn't just about catching a cheater. This is about what happens when a fed-up wife decides that sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to make it stick literally. Welcome back to the voice of Auntie Dorothy. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Your support truly encourages me to continue sharing these incredible tales with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from my sweethearts around the world. You see, for months, my husband, Ben Richard, had been telling me about his sweet old Auntie May, who had been going through such a hard time. He'd get these late-night calls from Auntie May, disappear for hours to help Auntie May with her problems, and spend his weekends doing yard work for poor, helpless Auntie May. I thought I had the most caring, family-oriented husband in the world. Turns out Auntie May was a 28-year-old brunette with a very different kind of relationship with my husband. What happened when I finally met the real Auntie May will make your blood boil. But what did I do about it? Well, let's just say that by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most shocking solutions are the only ones that really work. Well, let me tell you something, honey. Life has a way of making you feel like a complete fool when you least expect it. You think you know someone after 15 years of marriage, that you've got a good, solid relationship built on trust and honesty. But sometimes the person you're sleeping next to every night is living a completely different life. My name is Grace Richard, and up until 3 months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. I'm 45 years old, work as a dental hygienist at a practice downtown, and I genuinely believed I was married to one of the good guys. Ben Richard, my husband, is 47, works in construction management, and has always been the kind of man who seemed to care about family more than anything else. We'd been married for 15 years, together for 17. We met at a company picnic when I was 28 and he was 30. He was this charming guy with calloused hands and an easy smile who made me laugh until my sides hurt. He was the type of man who remembered birthdays, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and always talked about the importance of taking care of family. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our comfortable silences. We'd talk about maybe having kids someday, though we kept putting it off for various reasons. We had a nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars that were paid off, and what I thought was a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. But about 6 months ago, things started changing in ways that seemed positive, actually. Ben became more attentive to his family, especially to his elderly relatives. He started getting phone calls from his Auntie May, his father's sister, who lived about 40 minutes away. According to Ben, Auntie May was 73 years old, recently widowed, and struggling with everything from health problems to home maintenance issues. "Grace, I feel so bad for Aunt May," Ben would say after getting off the phone with her. "She's all alone now that Uncle Robert passed, and she's too proud to ask for help with most things. I think I'm the only family member who really checks on her." I thought it was sweet. Here was my husband, showing the kind of compassion and family loyalty that made me fall in love with him in the first place. When his phone would ring in the evenings and he'd see Auntie May on the caller ID, he'd apologize to me and step outside to take the call. "She gets emotional talking about Uncle Robert," he'd explain. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable listening to her cry." The calls became more frequent, 2 or 3 times a week, then almost daily. Ben Richard would spend 20 or 30 minutes talking to Auntie May, his voice soft and comforting. Sometimes I'd catch snippets of conversation through the window, him reassuring her that everything would be okay, that he'd always be there for her, that she wasn't alone. Then came the weekend visits. Ben started spending his Saturdays at Auntie May's house, helping with yard work, minor repairs, and grocery shopping. He'd leave early in the morning and come back in the evening, tired but satisfied that he'd been able to help someone who needed him. "You should see her face light up when I get there," he'd tell me. I think these visits are the highlight of her week. It makes me feel good to know I'm making a difference in her life. I suggested going with him a few times, thinking it would be nice to meet this important family member and maybe help out myself. But Ben always had reasons why that wouldn't work. "She's very shy around new people," he'd say. "It took months for her to feel comfortable with me. I think having a stranger there might overwhelm her. Or she's been having some health issues that make her self-conscious. I don't think she'd want someone she doesn't know seeing her like that." His explanations always made sense. I'd lived with Ben long enough to know he was genuinely thoughtful about other people's feelings. If he thought Auntie May would be more comfortable with just him, then that's what was best for her. The weekend visits stretched longer. What used to be 6 or 7 hours became 10 or 12. Ben would leave at 8 in the morning and not come home until 8 or 9 at night. When I'd ask about the long days, he'd have detailed explanations about all the projects they'd tackled. "We cleaned out Uncle Robert's workshop today," he'd say. "Aunt May couldn't bear to do it herself, so I spent most of the day sorting through his tools and organizing everything. Then we went through old photo albums because she wanted to share stories about him." The emotional labor seemed to be taking a toll on Ben. He'd come home exhausted, sometimes a little emotional himself. He'd shower immediately, saying he smelled like cleaning supplies or paint, then fall asleep early. I'd massage his shoulders and listen to him talk about how much Auntie May was struggling with her grief. During the week, Ben started making emergency trips to see Auntie May. She'd call upset about something: a leaky faucet, a scary noise in the middle of the night, confusion about medical bills, and Ben Richard would drop everything to go help her. "I can't just leave her in distress," he'd explain as he grabbed his keys. "She doesn't have anyone else to call." These emergency visits started happening during work hours. Ben Richard would get a call from Auntie May and tell his boss he had a family emergency. His supervisor was understanding at first. Everyone has elderly relatives who need help. But when it started happening weekly, then twice a week, I could see Ben Richard getting stressed about balancing his job responsibilities with his family obligations. "I feel torn," he confided in me one evening. "I love my job, but I can't just abandon Aunt May when she needs me. She's family." I suggested that maybe we should look into getting some professional help for Auntie May, a home health aide, a handyman service, maybe a grief counselor. But Ben was resistant to the idea. "She's very set in her ways," he said. "She doesn't trust strangers, and she's already comfortable with me. I think bringing in outsiders might actually make her more anxious." The phone calls started coming at odd hours. Ben's phone would ring at 10 or 11 at night, sometimes even later. He'd always answer, speaking in hushed tones so he wouldn't wake me. If I asked about it the next morning, he'd explain that Auntie May had trouble sleeping and sometimes called when she was feeling particularly lonely or scared. "She has nightmares about being alone in that big house," he'd say. "Sometimes talking to someone for a few minutes helps her calm down enough to get back to sleep." I noticed that Ben started keeping his phone closer to him, always making sure it was charged and within reach. He'd check it frequently throughout the day, and I assumed he was worried about missing an important call from Auntie May. His behavior around his phone became more protective. He started taking it with him to the bathroom, keeping it face down during dinner, setting it to silent mode more often. When I'd ask if Auntie May had called, he'd sometimes seem surprised, like he'd forgotten to mention it. "Oh yeah, she called earlier about her medication schedule," he'd say. "Nothing urgent." But despite all the time and energy Ben was investing in caring for Auntie May, he never seemed to want to talk about her in detail. When I'd ask specific questions about her health, her house, her life, his answers were always vague. "She's doing okay, just taking things one day at a time," he'd say. Or, "The house is old and needs a lot of work, but we're making progress." I started feeling a little left out of this important part of Ben's life. Here he was, developing this close relationship with a family member I'd never met, spending significant time and emotional energy caring for her, but I felt like I barely knew anything about her. When I mentioned this to Ben, he was apologetic, but didn't offer any solutions. "I know it seems like I'm keeping you separate from that part of my life," he said. "But honestly, dealing with Aunt May's situation is pretty draining. When I'm home with you, I just want to focus on us and not bring all that heaviness into our relationship." That explanation made sense, but it also made me feel a little guilty for wanting to be more involved. Here was my husband, being incredibly selfless and caring, and I was complaining about feeling left out. I decided to be more supportive and stop asking so many questions about Auntie May. But then I started noticing other changes. Ben began paying more attention to his appearance. He started buying nicer clothes, got haircuts more frequently, began using cologne regularly instead of just on special occasions. When I complimented him on looking good, he'd say he wanted to present himself well when he was out representing our family. "Aunt May always talks about how important it is to look respectable," he'd explain. "She's from a generation that really values that kind of thing." He also started working out more consistently, something he'd talked about for years but never really committed to. He joined a gym and started going 3 or 4 times a week, usually right after work or on his way to see Auntie May. "I need to stay in good shape if I'm going to keep up with all this physical work at her house," he'd say. "Plus, I want to be healthy enough to take care of her for as long as she needs me." The changes in Ben's routine meant we were spending less time together. Between his longer work hours, his gym sessions, and his time with Auntie May, we barely saw each other during the week. Our weekend time was cut in half because of his Saturday visits with her. I started feeling lonely in my own marriage, but I also felt selfish for resenting the time he spent caring for a grieving elderly woman. I tried to be understanding, to focus on how proud I was of Ben for being such a devoted nephew. But I missed my husband. One evening, about 4 months into this new routine, I decided to suggest that I start visiting Auntie May with Ben Richard. Not to intrude or take over, but just to offer an extra pair of hands and maybe provide some female companionship for her. "I've been thinking," I said over dinner. "Maybe I could come with you to visit Aunt May sometimes. I know you said she's shy, but if I just came along once and stayed in the background, maybe she'd eventually get comfortable with me. I'd love to help, and it might be nice for her to have another woman to talk to." Ben's reaction was immediate and stronger than I expected. "Grace, I really don't think that's a good idea. Aunt May is very fragile right now, and any change to her routine could set her back. She's finally starting to trust me and open up about her grief. Introducing someone new could undo months of progress," he continued. "Plus, some of the things we work on at her house are pretty personal. Going through Uncle Robert's belongings, talking about intimate memories, dealing with her health issues. I think she'd be mortified if someone she didn't know well was there for those conversations." His arguments made logical sense, but something about his tone bothered me. There was an urgency, almost a panic, in his voice that seemed disproportionate to my simple suggestion. But I dropped the subject, not wanting to cause problems. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Ben talk quietly on the phone with Auntie May in the next room, I had my first real moment of doubt. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, but for the first time, I started wondering if there was more to this story than Ben Richard was telling me. If you've ever had that gut feeling that something wasn't right in your relationship, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to take a turn that will blow your mind. Have you ever ignored red flags because you wanted to believe the best about someone you loved? Share your experience in the comments below. Now, let me tell you about the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October, and I had taken the afternoon off work because I wasn't feeling well. Nothing serious, just a headache and some nausea that made it hard to concentrate on patients. Dr. Peterson told me to go home and rest, that he could handle the afternoon appointments. I was planning to spend the day in bed with some tea and maybe catch up on some shows I'd been meaning to watch. But as I was driving home, I remembered that I needed to pick up Ben's prescription from the pharmacy. He'd been taking medication for high blood pressure, and I knew he was running low. The pharmacy was just a few blocks from our house, so I decided to swing by there first. That's when I saw him. Ben's truck was parked outside a small cafe downtown, nowhere near where Auntie May supposedly lived. I almost didn't think anything of it. Maybe he was grabbing lunch before heading to see her. But something made me look closer. Through the cafe window, I could see Ben sitting at a corner table, and he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman with long, dark hair who definitely was not 73 years old. She looked like she was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, and she was beautiful in that effortless way that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. I parked across the street and watched them. Ben was leaning forward, completely focused on whatever she was saying. He had that animated expression he used to get when we were dating, when he was genuinely interested and engaged. The woman was laughing at something he said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. My heart started pounding. This had to be innocent. Maybe this was someone who worked with Auntie May, a neighbor or a caregiver. Maybe Ben was meeting with her to coordinate care for his aunt. There had to be a reasonable explanation. But as I watched them, their body language told a different story. This wasn't a business meeting or a casual conversation between acquaintances. Ben was touching her face gently, the way he used to touch mine when we were falling in love. She was looking at him with obvious affection, playing with her hair in that unconscious way women do when they're attracted to someone. They sat there for almost an hour, completely absorbed in each other. I couldn't tear myself away, even though every minute I watched felt like torture. When they finally got up to leave, Ben walked her to a red Honda Civic and kissed her goodbye. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, a real kiss, the kind married men don't give to random women they've just met for coffee. I followed the Honda from a distance, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. She drove to an apartment complex about 15 minutes away, definitely not the area where Ben had told me Auntie May lived. I watched her go into a modern apartment building that looked like it housed young professionals, not elderly widows. That evening, when Ben came home from his supposed visit with Auntie May, I was waiting for him with a casual question. "How's Aunt May doing today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice normal. "Oh, she's hanging in there," Ben replied, not meeting my eyes. "We worked on organizing some more of Uncle Robert's things, found some old photo albums that made her pretty emotional." He was lying. I knew he was lying, but I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I needed more information, more proof of what I suspected was happening. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to everything. I noticed that when Ben's phone rang and he said it was Auntie May, he'd often smile before answering. The kind of smile you get when you're excited to talk to someone you care about. I noticed that he'd started buying breath mints and keeping them in his car. I noticed that he came home from his visits with Auntie May smelling like perfume that definitely wasn't something a 73-year-old woman would wear. The breaking point came the following Saturday. Ben left for his usual visit to Auntie May's, but instead of spending the day at home like I normally did, I decided to drive by the area where he'd told me she lived. I wanted to see this house he'd been working on, this woman he'd been caring for. I drove around for 2 hours, looking for any sign of Ben's truck in the neighborhood he'd described. Nothing. I expanded my search to nearby areas, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood the location. Still nothing. That's when I remembered the apartment complex where I'd seen the brunette go. On a whim, I drove there, and sure enough, Ben's truck was parked in the visitor section. I sat in my car for 3 hours, watching that building, and finally saw them come out together. They walked to his truck hand in hand, like any couple would. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, looking young and vibrant, and nothing like the frail elderly woman I'd been imagining. Ben opened the passenger door for her, kissed her again, and they drove off together. I followed them to a home improvement store, where they spent an hour picking out paint colors and looking at bathroom fixtures like they were decorating a place together. They were comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of intimacy and shared plans. This wasn't a nephew helping his elderly aunt with home repairs. This was a couple shopping for their future together. That night, I couldn't eat dinner. I couldn't focus on anything Ben was saying about his day with Auntie May. All I could think about was the lies, months and months of detailed, elaborate lies about a fictional elderly woman while he was actually having an affair with someone young enough to be his daughter. The next Tuesday, I did something I'd never done in 15 years of marriage. I went through Ben's phone while he was in the shower. I found her contact information immediately. Auntie May, just like he'd been saying. But when I clicked on the contact details, I saw a photo of the brunette from the cafe. Her real name was Madison Evans, and she was definitely not his aunt. I scrolled through their text messages, and what I found broke my heart completely. Months of conversations that ranged from sweet good morning messages to explicit discussions about their future together. Messages about how much they missed each other, about places they wanted to travel, about how he was planning to leave his wife soon. "I can't wait to wake up next to you every morning," one of his messages read. "Grace and I have been growing apart for years. She won't even notice when I'm gone." Another message: "You make me feel alive again, May. I forgot what it was like to be excited about life until I met you." And from her: "I love you, Ben. I know this situation is complicated, but I believe we're meant to be together. When you're ready to start our real life, I'll be here." I read months of conversations where they planned their weekends together, where he told her he loved her, where they discussed moving in together once he figured out how to end his marriage without losing too much in the divorce. But the worst part was reading his lies about me. He'd told Madison that we were essentially roommates, that we hadn't been intimate in years, that I was cold and distant and uninterested in him as a person. He painted me as someone who was holding him back from happiness, someone he stayed with out of obligation rather than love. None of it was true. Our marriage had its routine moments, sure, but we still laughed together, still showed affection, still made love regularly. The distance between us had only started when he began his affair, when he started investing all his emotional energy in another woman. I put his phone back exactly where I'd found it and went downstairs to make breakfast like nothing had happened. When Ben came down, freshly showered and getting ready for another day of lies, I asked him the same question I'd been asking for months. "Any plans to see Aunt May this week?" "Probably Thursday," he said, buttering his toast. "She's been having trouble with her kitchen sink, and I promised I'd take a look at it." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the supportive wife, while inside I was planning exactly how to make him pay for what he'd done to me. Because here's the thing about being betrayed by someone you trust completely. It doesn't just break your heart. It wakes up parts of yourself you never knew existed. That Thursday, while Ben was supposedly fixing Auntie May's kitchen sink, I drove to Madison's apartment complex and waited. Sure enough, they came back together around 6 o'clock, looking happy and relaxed after their afternoon together. But this time, instead of just watching them, I followed them up to her apartment. I waited in the hallway for 20 minutes, listening to the sounds of their relationship through the thin walls. Then I knocked on the door. When Madison answered, her face went white as she realized who I was. "Hi," I said pleasantly. "I'm Grace Richard, Ben Richard's wife. I think it's time we all had a conversation about Auntie May, don't you?" The look of panic in her eyes was almost satisfying. Almost. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will show you exactly what a fed-up wife is capable of when she's had enough of being lied to." What would you do if you discovered your partner had created an elaborate fake identity to cover their affair? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let me tell you about the most awkward conversation of my entire life. Standing in that hallway, looking at Madison's terrified face while I could hear Ben scrambling around inside her apartment, probably trying to figure out how to explain this situation. "Grace?" Ben's voice came from behind Madison, and I could hear the panic in it. "What are you doing here?" "Well, honey," I said, pushing past Madison into her living room, "I thought it was time I finally met your dear Auntie May, although she looks remarkably different from how you described her." The apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a 28-year-old woman. Modern furniture, trendy decorations, and absolutely nothing that suggested an elderly widow lived there. On the coffee table, I could see takeout containers from the restaurant Ben had told me he'd gone to for lunch that day. Ben stood there in his socks, his shirt wrinkled, looking like a man whose entire world had just collapsed. Madison wrapped her arms around herself, clearly wishing she could disappear. "Grace, I can explain," Ben Richards started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," I said. "For the past 6 months, you've been telling me about your poor, elderly Aunt May who needed so much help and support. The grieving widow who called you crying in the middle of the night. The frail old woman who was too shy to meet new people and too set in her ways to accept help from anyone but you." I turned to Madison. "You must be a remarkable actress to pull off being 73 years old over the phone. Though I have to say, you look amazing for your age." Madison finally found her voice. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Ben told me that you two were separated, that you were just living together until the divorce was finalized." I looked at my husband. "Did you really? That's interesting, because I don't remember us having any conversations about separation or divorce. But then again, we apparently have very different memories about a lot of things." Ben ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times when he was stressed. "Grace, please, can we talk about this at home? This isn't the place for—" "For what?" I interrupted. "For honesty? For finally telling the truth after months of lies? No, I think this is exactly the right place. This is where you've been spending your weekends, isn't it? This is where you've been when you told me you were doing yard work for Auntie May." The evidence of their relationship was everywhere once I knew what to look for. Men's clothes hanging in her closet. A second toothbrush in her bathroom. Photos on her refrigerator of them together at places Ben had never taken me. "How long?" I asked. "How long has this been going on?" Madison and Ben looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Madison answered, 8 months. 8 months. Longer than I'd suspected, longer than the story about Auntie May, which meant they'd been together before he'd even invented his fictional aunt. "So the whole Auntie May thing," I said, "was just to explain why you needed to disappear for hours at a time." Ben nodded miserably. "I never meant for it to go on this long. It just got complicated, and I didn't know how to end it without hurting everyone." "Without hurting everyone?" My voice got louder despite my efforts to stay calm. "Ben, you've been lying to my face for 8 months. You've been living a double life, making me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with my own husband. You've made me question my own instincts and feel bad about being suspicious when I had every right to be." I turned to Madison again. "And you? You knew he was married. You knew he was lying to me every single day. How did you justify that to yourself?" Madison started crying, which honestly just made me angrier. "I know it was wrong," she said, "but I loved him, and he said you didn't make each other happy anymore. He said your marriage had been over for years." "Our marriage was fine until he started cheating on me," I said. "Any problems we had were because he was investing all his time and energy in someone else while pretending to be the devoted husband at home." I looked around her apartment again, taking in all the details of the life my husband had been building without me. "So what was the plan? Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just going to keep up this charade until I figured it out on my own?" Ben sat down heavily on Madison's couch. "I was going to tell you. I've been trying to figure out how to do it without destroying everything." "Everything was already destroyed, Ben. The moment you decided to create a fictional elderly aunt instead of having an honest conversation with your wife about problems in our marriage." I stood there for another few minutes, letting the reality of the situation sink in. This wasn't just about the affair, though that was devastating enough. It was about the elaborate deception, the months of detailed lies, the way he'd manipulated my emotions and made me feel guilty for wanting to be part of his life. When I finally left Madison's apartment, I didn't say another word to either of them. I drove home in complete silence, my mind racing with everything I'd learned and everything I needed to process. Ben came home about 2 hours later. He found me sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the life I'd thought we were building together. "Grace," he said quietly, sitting down across from me, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please, can we talk about this? Can we figure out how to move forward? I looked at my husband. I really looked at him. The man I'd trusted completely, who I'd defended to friends when they made jokes about cheating husbands, who I'd believed was genuinely devoted to taking care of his elderly aunt. Tell me about Auntie May, I said. What? I want to hear about her. Tell me about this woman you created. What was her house like? What were her health problems? What did Uncle Robert die from? I want to hear all the details of this person you made up to justify lying to me for 8 months. Ben couldn't meet my eyes. Grace, please, let's not do this. No, I think we should, because I believed every word. I felt sorry for this imaginary woman. I worried about her when you'd come home upset after spending time with her. I respected your dedication to family and felt guilty for wanting more time with my own husband. So tell me about her, Ben. Tell me about the elaborate fiction you created to cover your affair. He couldn't do it. He sat there in silence while I recited back to him all the stories he'd told me. The phone calls, the emergency visits, the detailed explanations about home repairs and medical appointments and grief counseling. You're incredibly creative, I told him. You should write fiction for a living. You certainly have the imagination for it. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband for what I knew would be the last time, and I started planning. Not just my exit strategy from the marriage, but something more immediate. Something that would make him understand exactly what it felt like to be humiliated and betrayed. Because here's what Ben didn't know about me after 15 years of marriage. I wasn't just angry. I was furious. And a furious woman with nothing left to lose is a dangerous thing. I thought about all the Saturday afternoons I'd spent alone while he was with Madison, all the evenings I'd made dinner for one because he was supposedly comforting his grieving aunt, all the times I'd massaged his shoulders and listened to him talk about the emotional toll of caring for Auntie May. I thought about the lies he'd told Madison about me, about our marriage, about who I was as a person and a wife. I thought about how they'd probably laughed together about how gullible I was, how easy it was to fool the naive little wife with stories about family obligations. But most of all, I thought about the intimate betrayal. This wasn't just about sex, though that was part of it. This was about emotional intimacy, shared dreams, the kind of connection that should have belonged to our marriage. He'd given Madison the best parts of himself, while giving me the scraps of his attention and affection. I spent 3 days planning exactly what I was going to do, and when Saturday came around, the day Benrick normally spent with his Auntie May, I put my plan into action. Because sometimes, when someone has humiliated you completely, the only appropriate response is to return the favor. And I had the perfect idea for how to make this lesson stick. Don't forget to subscribe, because what I did next will go down in history as one of the most creative acts of justice ever executed by a betrayed wife. Do you think elaborate lies are worse than simple cheating? Have you ever been deceived by someone who created an entire fictional story to cover their betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let me tell you about the most satisfying Saturday of my entire life. Ben left that morning, at his usual time, telling me he was going to help Auntie May with some plumbing issues. He kissed me goodbye like he had hundreds of times before, completely unaware that I knew exactly where he was going and what he was really planning to do. But this Saturday was going to be different. Because while Ben thought he was heading off for another romantic afternoon with Madison, I had already been to their little love nest and made some very special preparations. You see, I've done my homework. I knew Madison worked late on Friday nights at the marketing firm downtown. I knew she always went to yoga class on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock. And I knew that Ben had a key to her apartment, something I'd discovered when I went through his things Thursday night while he was sleeping. So Friday night, while Madison was at work and Ben was home watching television with his unsuspecting wife, I borrowed his key and paid a little visit to her apartment. I wasn't there to vandalize anything or steal anything. I was there for one very specific purpose. In Madison's nightstand drawer, exactly where I expected to find it, was a tube of personal lubricant. the same brand that Ben kept in our bedroom at home, which made sense since he was apparently maintaining intimate relationships in two different locations. I carefully opened the tube and emptied out about half the contents. Then I filled it back up with something else. Something clear and viscous that looked exactly like what I'd removed. Something that would make their next romantic encounter absolutely unforgettable. Superglue. Clear, strong, fast-acting superglue. Now, before you judge me, let me explain my reasoning. I wasn't trying to seriously hurt anyone. I'd done my research, and I knew that while this would be uncomfortable and embarrassing, it wouldn't cause permanent damage. Modern medical facilities have solvents that can safely separate people who get accidentally glued together. It happens more often than you'd think. But what it would do is create a situation so mortifying, so impossible to explain away, that both Ben and Madison would have to face the consequences of their actions in the most literal way possible. They'd be stuck with each other, literally unable to separate, forced to call for help, and explain to medical professionals exactly how they'd gotten into such a predicament. I replaced the tube exactly where I'd found it and left her apartment. Then I went home and had the most peaceful night's sleep I'd had in months. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Saturday morning came, and Ben followed his usual routine. He showered, put on his nicest casual clothes, and told me he'd probably be gone most of the day because Auntie May had a long list of projects she needed help with. "You're such a good nephew," I told him, handing him his travel mug of coffee. "Aunt May is so lucky to have someone who cares about her so much." He actually had the nerve to look touched by my comment. "Family is important," he said. "I just want to make sure she knows she's not alone." I watched him drive away, knowing exactly what was going to happen and when. Madison's yoga class ended at 11:30. She'd be home by noon. Ben would arrive shortly after that, and they'd probably spend some time talking, maybe have lunch together, before things moved in a more intimate direction. I had estimated that the moment of truth would come sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I went about my usual Saturday routine, grocery shopping, cleaning the house, doing laundry, while periodically checking my phone for the call I knew was coming. It came at 2:47 p.m. "Grace?" Ben's voice was panicked, strained, and completely unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. "I need your help. There's been an accident." "An accident?" I asked, putting just the right amount of concern in my voice. "Are you hurt? Where are you?" "I'm at..." He paused, and I could hear Madison crying in the background. "I'm at a friend's place, and we need to get to the hospital. Can you meet us at the emergency room?" "The hospital? Ben, what happened? Are you okay?" There was another long pause. It's hard to explain over the phone. Just please meet us at St. Mary's emergency room as soon as you can." "Of course," I said. "I'll be right there." I took my time getting ready, making sure I looked appropriately concerned but put together. I wanted to look like the devoted wife rushing to help her husband in his time of need, which in a twisted way, I suppose I was. When I arrived at the emergency room, I found Ben and Madison in a private room, with a doctor and 2 nurses who were clearly trying very hard to maintain their professional composure while dealing with what was obviously the most unusual case they'd seen in a while. Ben and Madison were sitting on the examination table, still partially connected to each other, covered by hospital gowns that couldn't quite hide their predicament. Their faces were red with embarrassment, and Madison was still crying softly. "Mrs. Richard?" The doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a barely suppressed smile, approached me. "I'm Dr. Mary. Your husband and his friend have had what we might call an intimate mishap involving an adhesive substance." I put on my most confused expression. "I don't understand. What kind of accident?" Dr. Mary glanced at Ben, who was staring at the floor like he wanted to disappear through it. "It appears that someone accidentally used superglue instead of personal lubricant. They became adhered to each other and required medical intervention to separate them safely." The room was dead silent, except for Madison's sniffling and the humming of medical equipment. I looked at my husband, who finally raised his eyes to meet mine. In that moment, I saw everything. The humiliation, the realization that his affair was now completely exposed, and something else. Recognition. How does something like that happen? I asked innocently. How do you accidentally use superglue instead of the other thing? That's an excellent question, Dr. Mary said. It's quite unusual for someone to confuse the two, given that they're typically stored in very different places and have different packaging. Ben was looking at me with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. He knew. Somehow, he knew that this wasn't an accident, that I was responsible for his current predicament. Were you able to separate them? I asked the doctor, still playing my role as the concerned wife. Yes, we have special solvents for situations like this. It took about 2 hours, and they'll both be sore for a few days, but there's no permanent damage. They'll need to apply antibiotic cream and avoid any intimate contact for at least 2 weeks while the skin heals. 2 weeks of enforced celibacy. I couldn't have planned it better myself. Mrs. Richard, Dr. Mary continued, your husband will need someone to help him with the cream application for the first few days. The affected areas are difficult for him to reach on his own. I looked at Ben, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Of course, I said, whatever he needs to recover. After Dr. Mary left us alone, the three of us sat in awkward silence for several minutes. Finally, Madison spoke up. Grace, I am so sorry about all of this. About the affair, about lying to you, about everything. I know nothing I say can make this better, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at this young woman who had unknowingly become part of my elaborate plan for justice. Madison, you're not the one who's been married to me for 15 years. You're not the one who created an elaborate fictional aunt to explain where you were spending your time. You fell for his lies just like I did. Then I turned to Ben. But you looked me in the eye every single day for 8 months and lied to me. You made me feel crazy for being suspicious. You made me feel guilty for wanting to spend time with my own husband. And you told her that our marriage was over when you'd never even discussed that with me. Ben finally found his voice. Grace, how did this happen? The glue? This wasn't an accident, was it? I met his eyes directly. What are you asking me, Ben? I'm asking if you somehow knew that I was to meet up with Madison, if you planned this. The room was completely silent. Madison was looking back and forth between us, clearly confused about what was happening. Are you seriously asking me if I sabotaged your affair? I said. If I somehow arranged for you to end up glued to your mistress in the most humiliating way possible? Did you? I stood up slowly, gathering my purse and keys. You know what, Ben? After 8 months of elaborate lies about Auntie May, after discovering that you've been living a double life and telling another woman that our marriage was over without bothering to mention it to me, I think the real question is, does it matter? I walked toward the door, then turned back. Whether this was an accident or the universe's way of giving you exactly what you deserved, the result is the same. Your affair is over. Your lies have caught up with you, and everyone involved has learned something valuable about the consequences of betrayal. I paused at the door. Oh, and Ben? Don't bother coming home tonight, or any night. I'll have your things packed and ready for pickup by Monday. As I walked out of that hospital room, leaving my cheating husband literally stuck with the consequences of his actions, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Satisfaction. Complete, total satisfaction. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Ben and Madison's relationship didn't survive the humiliation. Apparently, being glued together in the emergency room wasn't the romantic bonding experience either of them had hoped for. Ben moved back in with his mother temporarily, which seemed fitting given his talent for creating fictional family members. I kept the house, got a generous settlement, and started a new life that didn't involve wondering where my husband really was or who he was really with. I joined a book club, started taking art classes, and began dating again after a year. Do I regret what I did? That's complicated. I regret that my marriage ended. I regret that I was betrayed so completely, and I regret that I felt driven to such extreme measures. But do I regret making sure that Ben faced real consequences for his actions instead of just walking away unscathed? No, I don't regret that at all. Sometimes people need to be taught that their actions have consequences. And sometimes, when someone has lied to you so thoroughly and for so long, the only way to make them understand the gravity of what they've done is to ensure they get stuck with it. Literally. Trust is everything in a relationship, honey. Once it's broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild. But what I learned through all of this is that you don't have to be a victim. You don't have to just accept betrayal and move on quietly. Sometimes you can take control of the situation and make sure justice is served, even if you have to serve it yourself. If this story taught you anything about standing up for yourself when you've been betrayed, make sure you subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most important lesson is that you're stronger than you think, and you don't have to accept being treated poorly by anyone, even someone you love. What would you have done in my situation? Do you think I went too far, or did Ben Richard get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts on these real-life situations that test what we're really capable of when pushed to our limits.